The morning sun shone brightly over London as a crowd gathered near Buckingham Palace. It was a busy day, and tourists from many countries had come to see the famous royal guards. Everyone had heard stories about the guards, how they never smiled, how they stood still no matter what, and how the tall black horses they rode were some of the finest in the world. Cameras clicked, children pointed with excitement, and people lined up along the barriers to watch. For most visitors, this was a moment to admire and take photos respectfully, but among the large group, a small cluster of tourists decided to behave differently. They were loud from the beginning. They joked, laughed too much, and kept pushing each other closer to the guards and their horses. At first it seemed harmless, just a few friends being silly on a holiday. But slowly their behavior started to draw attention. While most people watched quietly, these tourists wanted to make a scene. One of them, a tall man with a bright red jacket, leaned over the barrier and waved his hand at one of the horses as if it were a farm animal. The horse, a tall and majestic black stallion, flicked its ears back and twitched slightly, but it stayed calm, trained to ignore distractions. Still, locals nearby frowned. They had seen such things before and knew it could go wrong. The guards sat firmly in their saddles, eyes forward, their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats making them look like statues. They were trained for discipline. They were not actors for tourists to tease, nor were the horses pets for people to touch. Yet the group of tourists whispered among themselves, daring each other to get closer and see if the guards move. The laughter grew louder. Phones were raised to capture every silly moment. The tourists didn't notice the change in the atmosphere, but others around them did. The mood shifted from cheerful to uneasy, and many in the crowd began to back away, sensing that the tourists were pushing the limits. A young woman from the group giggled loudly and clapped her hands right near one horse's face. The horse's nostrils flared and it shook its head, pulling slightly on the reins. Its rider remained steady, controlling the animal with silent skill. But that was the first clear sign that the horse was uncomfortable. The crowd gasped, but the group laughed even louder, proud of the reaction they had caused. "Did you see that?" one of them said, pointing. "It moved because of me." His voice carried, and it annoyed the onlookers who believed the guards and horses deserved respect, not mockery. Nearby, a mother pulled her children away, whispering that it was not safe to stand too close. She knew that the guards' horses were strong and trained for serious duties, not to tolerate foolish games. The tourists, however, ignored the warning signs. They were enjoying the attention, enjoying how their behavior stood out in the otherwise calm and quiet setting. One man even pretended to salute the guard in a mocking way, posing for pictures while his friends laughed. The guards did not flinch. Their silence was powerful, and for many in the crowd that silence spoke louder than words. But the foolish tourists took it as a challenge. The palace gates gleamed under the sunlight, and the area felt grand, almost sacred. Visitors respected the space, but this group seemed blind to it. Their noise and actions clashed with the dignity of the place. People shook their heads, some recording videos, knowing something was bound to happen. Every horse has patience, but every horse also has limits. And every guard, though trained to stay calm, knows when safety must come first. The atmosphere grew heavier when one of the tourists tried to stretch his arm out farther, attempting to touch the horse's reins. The animal jerked its head back sharply, stomping a hoof against the stone ground with a loud thud. The sound made many people jump. It was a warning sign, a message from the horse itself. Enough was enough. The crowd fell quiet, holding their breath. But the tourists? They burst into laughter again, as if it were all part of a funny show. "It's just a horse," one of them said carelessly. But anyone who knew better could see the danger. A horse of that size and power was not just a horse. It was an animal with strength that could easily throw a person down if disrespected. Still, the guards held their positions, faces calm and unreadable. Tourists who came often had tried similar things before, and the guards knew when to act. For now they were waiting, watching, letting the situation play out, but every second felt heavier, the tension building like a storm waiting to break. The tourists, too caught up in their own amusement, didn't notice that the rest of the crowd was no longer laughing with them. People had pulled back, creating space, expecting trouble. It was as if the crowd knew that a line had been crossed. By now, even the horses' calm patience was running thin. Their ears twitched back and forth, their heads tossed slightly, and their hooves shuffled against the stone floor. Anyone with sense would have stepped back at that point. But the foolish tourists leaned in closer, smiling for cameras, thinking they were clever for making the royal horses move. They didn't know that their game was about to turn into a lesson they would never forget. The moment stretched on like a silent warning. The tourists stood too close, the horses shifted restlessly, and the guards remained still but sharp. And just as the tourists prepared to take another round of silly photos, the first sign of real regret began to appear. Something was about to change. The tension that had built in Part 1 did not fade away. Instead, it grew heavier as the foolish tourists continued their behavior. The palace square was supposed to feel like a calm and grand place, but their loud voices broke that peace. While most of the visitors stood respectfully with cameras in hand, this group was treating the area as if it were their playground. They were not only testing the patience of the horses, but also the patience of everyone watching. The first horse had already stomped its hoof, a sign that anyone with sense would take as a warning. But instead of stepping back, one of the tourists, a young man in a bright cap, decided to push the limit even more. He leaned so far over the barrier that the crowd gasped, thinking he might touch the reins. The horse jerked its head and let out a sharp snort. The sound was powerful, deep, and filled the air like a drumbeat. The people standing nearby jumped back. Mothers pulled their children closer, and even the man himself froze for a second. But then, almost as if embarrassed to be afraid, he laughed and shouted to his friends, "Did you see that? It's just a horse, nothing to worry about." His friends cheered him on. One woman from the group clapped and shouted loudly, almost like she was teasing the horse. Her high voice echoed off the stone walls, startling not just the animals but the people around her. A father standing nearby whispered to his teenage son, "They don't understand how dangerous this is. These horses are trained, but they're not toys." The boy nodded, eyes wide, as he watched the scene unfold. The guards themselves had not moved yet. Their discipline was clear. They sat tall in their saddles, eyes forward, showing no reaction to the laughter, the noise, or the mocking salutes. Their red coats and tall black hats looked striking against the pale stone background. But though they looked still as statues, their awareness was sharp. Every guard could see and hear what was happening, and they were ready to act if things got out of hand. Then the children in the tourist group joined in. They copied their parents' behavior, clapping their hands, stomping their feet, and yelling near the horses. The animals shifted uneasily, their ears flicking back. A small black horse tossed its head with force, and the sound of its bridle chains rattling made the moment even more tense. One of the children squealed with laughter, but nearby, another child who belonged to a different family began to cry. The mood was no longer festive, it was on edge. The crowd began to mutter. People whispered warnings, some even speaking out loud. "Step back. Don't do that." But the tourists ignored them. They seemed to enjoy the attention, as though making a scene was more important than respecting the place they had come to visit. They posed for more photos, one man making a silly face beside the horse while his friend snapped pictures quickly. A woman adjusted her scarf and pretended to challenge the guard by standing with her arms folded, mocking his straight posture. The laughter from their group filled the air, but it was clear that no one else found it funny anymore. Finally, the tension reached its breaking point. The largest horse in the line stomped both hooves hard against the ground, the sound echoing like thunder. Its head swung sharply to the side, nearly bumping into the man in the red jacket who had leaned too far forward. The man stumbled back, his laughter breaking into nervous silence for the first time. The horse's eyes were wide and alert, nostrils flaring as it let out a powerful snort that blew dust into the air. The crowd gasped and cameras clicked, capturing the moment. Still, the group did not fully understand the seriousness of what they were doing. They laughed again, trying to cover up their nerves. But the guards had reached their limit. For the first time, one of them moved. He turned his head slightly, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Stand back!" The words cut through the air like a whip. The silence that followed was heavy. People froze in place. The tourists blinked, shocked that the guard had actually spoken. Many had thought the guards were silent no matter what, but now they realized this was not a game. The guard's command wasn't just for the foolish group. It was also for the safety of the crowd, for the children watching, and for the horses that had been pushed too far. The words echoed for several seconds, and the group's laughter finally began to fade. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. The man in the cap shuffled his feet nervously. The woman who had clapped lowered her hands, and the children stood quiet, staring wide-eyed at the guard. But the story did not end with just words. One of the horses, already restless, lifted onto its hind legs with a sudden movement. It reared up, its front hooves striking the air while it let out a loud, fierce neigh. The sound was unlike anything the crowd had heard before, sharp, powerful, and filled with warning. People screamed and jumped back. The tourists stumbled, nearly falling as they scrambled away from the barrier. The man in the red jacket dropped his phone in shock, the device clattering loudly on the stone floor. The horse came down with a heavy thud, its rider still in perfect control, guiding the animal back into position. The guard's face was calm, his grip strong, showing his training and discipline. The horse stood tall again, proud and strong, its chest heaving as it snorted once more. For the first time, the tourists realized just how serious their mistake had been. The laughter was gone. Their faces turned pale, their eyes wide, their voices quiet. The crowd around them let out a collective sigh. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered about how close the tourists had come to real danger. Parents hugged their children, grateful that the guards had kept control of the situation. The foolish group, however, stood frozen, no longer brave, no longer loud. They had thought they were being clever, but now they were learning a hard lesson in respect. And yet this was only the beginning of the consequences they were about to face. The air was thick with silence after the horse reared up, and the guard's command echoed through the courtyard. Everyone in the crowd stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. The foolish tourists who had been laughing and joking moments before were no longer smiling. Their eyes darted around, searching for a way to escape the attention now fixed on them. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had once been light-hearted sightseeing had turned into a tense lesson in respect, and all of it was unfolding in front of dozens of strangers with phones raised, recording every second. The first sign that things were far from over came from the horses themselves. Even though the guards had calmed them, their unease was still visible. One horse pawed at the ground, another flicked its tail sharply, and all of them stood tall, ears back, watching every movement of the crowd. The discipline of the animals was clear, but so was their strength. Anyone who looked at them now could see that these were not creatures to be mocked. They were powerful, trained, and part of a centuries-old tradition that demanded respect. The foolish group, still shaken from the horse's sudden movement, tried to laugh off their fear. One of the men bent down to pick up the phone he had dropped earlier, but his hands trembled so much that he nearly dropped it again. His friends whispered nervously, trying to decide whether to stay or walk away. But before they could make a decision, another guard moved. His horse shifted forward, its hooves clicking sharply against the stone ground. He did not say a word this time. He only guided the horse slightly closer to the barrier, making it clear without speaking that the tourists were too close. The message was powerful. The crowd around them had already pulled back, giving space. Mothers held their children's hands tightly. Older visitors shook their heads, and many phones stayed raised, recording every second of the tourists' growing discomfort. It was no longer entertainment for them. It was a story they would tell when they went home. Everyone could sense the guards' patience had run out, and the tourists were moments away from consequences they had not expected. One of the women from the group tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. "It's fine. They're not allowed to do anything," she whispered to her friend, though her voice carried enough for nearby people to hear. Several locals turned sharply toward her, their expressions filled with disbelief. They knew the truth. The guards may stay silent most of the time, but when it came to safety and respect, they had the full authority to act. The guards were no longer just silent figures in red uniforms. They had transformed into something larger in the eyes of the tourists, symbols of discipline, tradition, and authority. And the tourists realized, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that mocking such authority had real risks. Suddenly, another horse gave a loud, sharp neigh. Its head swung, and the sound cut through the air, bouncing off the palace walls. The children from the tourist group screamed and clung to their parents, no longer finding the situation funny. One little girl buried her face into her mother's coat, shaking. For the first time, the parents looked guilty. Their careless behavior had scared their own children, and it was happening in front of hundreds of strangers. The shame of the moment burned in their faces, though they still tried to act calm. Then it happened. The second guard broke his silence. His voice was deeper than the first, filled with authority and certainty. "Do not touch the horses. Move back immediately." His words thundered across the courtyard, and even though he did not raise his voice to a scream, it was strong enough to make people flinch. The foolish tourists stumbled backward at once, pulling their children with them. The woman who had been laughing earlier now looked pale, her hand clutching her daughter's arm tightly as they retreated from the barrier. The crowd applauded softly, not out of mockery but out of relief. It was a rare thing to hear the guards speak, and it reminded everyone of how serious their role was. The tourists were no longer bold, no longer mocking. They had been reduced to silence, their bravado shattered by a few sharp commands and the powerful movements of the horses. Still, the lesson was not finished. The largest horse, the same one that had reared earlier, shifted its weight and stomped hard against the stone floor again. The sound echoed like a drumbeat, reminding everyone of the strength standing before them. The tourists stumbled further back, their phones now lowered, no longer used to record but clutched tightly in nervous hands. Their earlier excitement had turned into regret. Some in the crowd whispered that the group might be escorted away. Others said they deserved to be banned from the area altogether. The foolish group overheard these whispers, and their shame deepened. What had started as a silly game to make videos for social media was now turning into an embarrassing moment that strangers would likely share online with judgment and criticism. The guards returned to their stillness, their discipline once again on full display. But the power of their presence was now impossible for anyone to ignore. The tourists finally began to step back on their own, realizing they had gone too far. But even as they moved, the crowd's eyes followed them, and the weight of those stares was heavy. The lesson was clear now. These were not actors, not performers, and not statues to mock. They were guards serving their country, standing with honor. The horses were not simple animals, but trained companions, carrying centuries of tradition in their proud stance. And the palace was not a stage for childish games, but a place of history and dignity. As the group shuffled backward, their laughter gone and their heads lowered, it became clear that they had learned their lesson the hard way. They had wanted to see if the guards would move, and they had found out the answer. Yes, they would move, and when they did, it was not for entertainment but for authority, discipline, and respect. And though the guards had spoken only a few words, those words carried more weight than any long speech. The tourists would remember them forever. But the story was not finished. Security officer had already been alerted, and the consequences for the foolish group were only beginning. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of horses shifting their hooves on the stone floor and the occasional murmur of the crowd. The foolish tourists who had started the disturbance stood awkwardly, their faces red with embarrassment. What had begun as a silly game had turned into a tense moment witnessed by hundreds of strangers, and the shame was written all over them. But this was not the end. The palace grounds were always under watch, and the guards were not the only ones who could take action. The sound of quick footsteps grew louder as two security officers approached. They were dressed in dark uniforms, radios clipped to their shoulders, their movements sharp and professional. They had been alerted by the guards' warning shouts and by the restless movement of the horses. Their presence added another layer of seriousness to the situation. The crowd parted slightly to let them through, their eyes following with anticipation. Everyone knew the foolish tourists were about to face consequences. The officers reached the group and wasted no time. One officer raised his hand firmly and said, "Step away from the barrier immediately." His voice was calm but commanding. The tourists, who had once been laughing loudly, now obeyed without argument. They shuffled backward, their children clinging to them, their eyes darting nervously at the crowd watching. Cameras clicked again, but this time no one was recording them as entertainment. It was documentation of their embarrassment. The second officer, a tall man with a stern expression, addressed them directly. "Do you realize how dangerous your actions were? These horses are working animals. They are trained for duty, not for your games. You could have caused serious harm to yourselves and others." His words were heavy, not shouted, but delivered in a way that carried authority. The group remained quiet, their earlier boldness completely gone. A woman tried to mutter something about just having fun, but the officer cut her off. "This is not fun. This is a place of respect and tradition. Your behavior was foolish and reckless." The tourists looked down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. Their children stood silently, Sensing the seriousness of the moment, the officer pointed toward a section away from the barrier. "You will stay back there. If you continue, you will be removed from the area entirely." His words left no room for negotiation. The group nodded quickly and moved backward, standing in the open space where they could still see but no longer disturb. The crowd around them seemed relieved. Some even clapped quietly, not out of cruelty but out of respect for the guards and the officers who had restored order. Parents whispered to their children about the importance of respect, turning the incident into a lesson. Tourists from other countries shook their heads, exchanging looks that clearly said, they should have known better. The foolish group, now silent and humbled, had become an example of what not to do. Meanwhile, the guards and horses returned to their composure. The horses calmed under the steady hands of their riders, their strong bodies standing still once again, their heads held high. It was as if nothing had happened, though the crowd knew better. The discipline of both the men and the animals was remarkable. Despite being tested and provoked, they had shown restraint until it was absolutely necessary to act. That too was a lesson for everyone watching. The tourists tried to blend back into the crowd, but it was impossible. Their loud behavior earlier had made them too memorable. People kept glancing at them, whispering about what had happened. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others muttered about how lucky they were that nothing worse had happened. The group huddled together, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. Their earlier energy was gone, replaced by regret. One of the men pulled out his phone, perhaps to check the video he had been recording. But when he looked at the screen, his expression fell. Instead of a funny memory, the video showed him flinching in fear when the horse reared up, his laughter turning to nervous silence. He quickly pocketed the phone, unwilling to show it to anyone. The woman beside him whispered, "This is going to be all over the internet." She was right. Dozens of people had recorded the entire scene, and within hours their behavior would be shared online, judged by strangers around the world. The security officers remained nearby for a few more minutes, watching the group to ensure they did not cause any more trouble. The foolish tourists stood quietly, heads lowered, finally behaving like the rest of the respectful crowd. But the damage had already been done. They had turned what should have been a memorable and beautiful experience into one filled with shame. The palace square slowly regained its calm atmosphere. The crowd once again admired the guards and their horses, snapping photos and watching the ceremony with quiet awe. But the memory of the incident lingered. Parents whispered reminders to their children, and older visitors spoke softly about the importance of respecting traditions wherever you travel. The foolish tourists had provided a lesson not just for themselves, but for everyone who had witnessed the scene. Even though they had been warned and scolded, the tourists could not shake off the weight of their mistake. They avoided eye contact with strangers, hoping the attention would fade. But they could not escape the truth. Their actions had been disrespectful, and they had been corrected in front of hundreds of people. The humiliation would follow them long after they left the palace gates. As the security officers finally stepped back to their positions, the guards and horses stood once again in their iconic stillness. The palace square looked as it always had, grand, dignified, and untouchable. But for those who had seen the event unfold, the silence carried a new meaning. It was no longer just a quiet scene of tradition. It was a reminder of what respect meant, and of what happened when people failed to show it. The foolish tourists, now standing far in the back, finally realized something they had ignored earlier. They were guests in another country, standing in front of a symbol of history and culture. Their laughter and teasing had not only disrespected the guards and horses, but also the spirit of the place itself. And though no one said it out loud, they all knew the truth. They would never forget this day, not because of the photos they had taken, but because of the shame they had created, and yet their story was not finished. While they had been warned by security, the consequences of their actions would stretch further than they realized. The videos recorded by the crowd were already making their way online, and soon their foolish behavior would be judged not only in the courtyard, but around the world. The day that had started with laughter and excitement for the group of tourists ended in silence and shame. After being warned by the guards and scolded by the security officers, they stood quietly at the back of the crowd, no longer drawing attention with loud voices. But though they had stepped away, Their actions had already been seen, heard, and recorded by many others. The world outside Buckingham Palace was about to learn of their foolish mistake, and the regret they felt would only grow stronger with time. As the ceremony continued, other visitors focused on the beauty of the guards, the rhythm of the horses' movements, and the grandeur of the palace itself. But the tourists could not enjoy any of it. They were too aware of the stares, the whispers, and the quiet judgment surrounding them. Every time they glanced at someone nearby, they felt the weight of disapproval. Parents pulled their children a little closer whenever the group passed, as though to quietly remind them not to behave the same way. The tourists who once wanted to stand out now wished they could disappear. When the ceremony ended and the guards marched with perfect precision back toward their post, the crowd broke into respectful applause. Cameras captured the moment, tourists cheered softly, and people smiled as they admired the tradition. But for the foolish group, the sound of applause was like a reminder of what they had ruined for themselves. While others left with beautiful photos and happy memories, they were leaving with something very different: humiliation. As they walked away from the palace gates, one of the men muttered, "Let's just go. It's over." But deep inside, he knew it wasn't over. Around them, people still held up phones, and some were already posting the videos online. Strangers were writing captions, adding comments, and sharing the clips with their friends. What had been a private mistake in the courtyard was now becoming public. Within hours, their behavior would be seen by thousands, maybe even millions. By evening, the videos had spread quickly on social media. Headlines popped up with titles like "Tourists Anger Royal Guards Horses" and "Foolish Visitors Learn Hard Lesson at Buckingham Palace." The clips showed the group laughing, clapping, and mocking, followed by the sudden moment when the horse reared up and the guard shouted at them. Comment sections filled with strong opinions. People from different countries wrote about how disrespectful the behavior was. Others praised the guards and horses for their discipline. Many expressed embarrassment on behalf of the tourists. The group did not expect this kind of attention. When they checked their own phones later, they saw their faces everywhere. Friends from back home were sending messages asking, "Was this you in the video?" Family members expressed disappointment. Strangers online criticized them harshly. What they had thought would be a funny memory to share became a source of shame. The weight of regret grew heavier with every new message and every new video that spread. The children in the group, too, felt the impact. At school, their classmates had seen the clips. Some teased them while others asked endless questions. The children, who had laughed earlier, now wished their parents had never acted so carelessly. Even they understood in their young hearts that respect had been the missing piece that day. But the lesson reached further than just the group itself. For the many who watched the videos online, it became an example of what not to do as a tourist. Travel bloggers used the story to remind their readers about the importance of respecting traditions and cultures. Teachers shared the video with students explaining why discipline and dignity mattered in public places. Parents showed the clip to their children as a warning. This is why you behave respectfully when you travel. Back in London, the palace courtyard returned to its usual rhythm. Day after day, new visitors came, watched the guards, and took photos. The foolish tourists were forgotten by the guards and horses, who continued their duties with the same silent strength as always. But in the memory of the crowd who had been there that day, and in the eyes of millions who had watched the videos online, the lesson lived on. The group themselves never fully escaped the regret. Whenever they looked back at their trip to London, they did not remember the beauty of the palace or the dignity of the guards. They remembered the shame. They remembered the horse rearing, the guard's booming voice, and the eyes of the crowd staring at them with disappointment. Instead of a happy travel story, they carried a memory that taught them one of life's most important lessons. Respect is not optional. In the years that followed, whenever they traveled again, they behaved differently. They stayed quieter in sacred places. They taught their children to be calm around animals, and they avoided drawing attention to themselves. In some ways, the embarrassment of that day became a turning point. They had been foolish once, but they promised themselves never to repeat the same mistake. And so the story that began with laughter and arrogance ended with silence and humility. The royal guards and their powerful horses had done more than protect the palace. They had reminded the world that dignity deserves respect, and foolishness always comes with consequences. The tourists had wanted attention, but what they received instead was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. That day, they walked away from Buckingham Palace with heavy hearts, but the palace itself remained unchanged. The guards stood tall, the horses gleamed under the sunlight, and the tradition carried on as it always had, untouched by the noise of foolish people, stronger than the arrogance of any visitor, and respected by those who understood its meaning. For the foolish tourists, the regret was instant, but the memory was lasting. They had learned in the hardest way possible that respect is a gift you give not just to others, but also to yourself. Without it, even the most beautiful trip can turn into a story of shame. With it, every journey can become a story of honor.